My name is Chikle. I'm the manager of community engagement here at the O'Keeffe Museum. And I would like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude and acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I would like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today. Your support made this event possible. And if you are not a member yet and enjoy this program, please consider joining today. Visit gokm.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, please place your questions in the chat, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the conversation. Please note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the O'Keeffe Museum's website in about a week's time. Captions in both English and Spanish will be made available. Today we have a few folks that I know very well, thankfully, here at the O'Keeffe Museum. So we have, let me start off by introducing, sorry, I'm just pulling up my bios really quick. So I'd like to start off by introducing Agapita Lopez. Agapita, also known as Pita to us, began working for American artist Georgia O'Keeffe in late 1974 as a companion and became her personal secretary in 1978 until her death on March 6, 1986. A third-generation employee, her grandfather and mother also worked for Miss O'Keeffe. She continued working with O'Keeffe Estate in 1986 and then for the Georgia O'Keeffe Foundation in 1989 as its secretary, later serving as the foundation's executive director from 1999 to 2006. As the project director for the Abiquiu Historic Properties, she oversees the maintenance and preservation of O'Keeffe's Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch homes for the O'Keeffe Museum. Along with author and scholar Barbara Buehler Lines, she co-wrote the publication Georgia O'Keeffe and her houses, Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch. With her brother Belarmino Lopez, the New Mexico Historic Preservation Division presented them with the Lifetime Achievement Award in 2015. You can see Pizza on the screen now, sharing a screen with Justina Renzoni. Justina joined the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in 2018 as the curator of historic properties. She oversees tours, programs, and exhibitions connected to Georgia O'Keeffe's two historic homes. And then the other person joining us on screen, if you've been to any of the M-Walks within the past couple of months, you've seen Ariel. Ariel Plotek is the curator of fine art here at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'm actually just going to hand it over to Ariel.
Thank you, Chikle, so much. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. I always find this to be the most challenging part of the presentation. Let's see now. There we go. Let's start there. How does that look? Does it look good to you, Peter?
It does.
All right, excellent. It's nice that I get to have we can sort of give each other some feedback as we go. I always prefer doing this as doing this as a kind of tag team effort. I think it's more fun for us, and it's probably more interesting for our viewers as well. So really pleased to be here with you both today. I'm going to take a little minute first to just really walk us through this recent exhibition at the museum, Making a Life, we've called it. And what we had in mind when we started thinking about this show was really, on the one hand, Georgia O'Keeffe as a maker in the sort of 21st century sense, That is, as someone who lived farm to table at her homes at Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch, who made some of her own artist materials, pastels, who trimmed the brushes that she used, who took a hand in the kitchen, and who was even I think there's something to be said about the way in which she sort of made and fashioned her persona through the way she dressed and the way that she presented herself. So all of those are going to be subjects that we're going to touch on today. But just for the purposes of those of you who haven't seen or won't have the opportunity to see this exhibition, I wanted to just walk us through it here. So we'll be talking more about this case with Georgia O'Keeffe's Stetson and a pin that was a gift from Alexander Calder. But I also just want to call attention to the mannequin with what I've come to think of as Georgia's sort of uniform, the black and white wrap dresses, the Hector Aguilar silver and suede belt, something you'll see her wearing in a great many of her portraits. Let's move on to this. We'll be talking more about the pin in just a moment. Here, though, is a view of a little corner of one of the galleries in the show that features not only Georgia O'Keeffe's clothing, so you see some of the wrap dresses there hanging on the right, but also it's an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about her relationship with her tailor in Santa Fe, Carol Sarkissian. And so the way in which the two of them were sort of collaborators again in the creation of this image that became so very iconic, and which we recognize in photographs like the portraits that are hanging there on the wall behind the case. We're going to talk a little bit about the Eames chair, the Charles and Ray Eames designed chair that you see on that deck. So we'll return to that a little later. Here, though, is an image of that case with, so Carol Sarkissian's seamstress's sort of model for one of these wrap dresses. This was the pattern, I should say, that Sarkissian would use in fashioning one of these iconic black dresses, and we happen to have in our collection things like a little pincushion that belonged to O'Keeffe. So one of the wonderful things about this show is it's also an opportunity for us really to present the true scope of the collections of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum that go far beyond merely the paintings on the wall or photographs like the one that you see hanging here. There's much more to the O'Keeffe than that, and of course the historic houses are an important part of that. We sometimes talk about the houses as being the most important things in our collection. Really, there's nothing else like these historic properties, and so we wanted to feature them in the exhibition as well. So what you're seeing here on the left is a case that includes some of O'Keeffe's cookbooks and then sort of her coffee and tea paraphernalia that we'll talk about briefly. We'll come back to it. And then in the meantime, I should mention these fantastic portraits of O'Keeffe, both dining, having breakfast alone at the Abiquiu house in that framed photograph, and then that sort of that wall-sized picture is of O'Keeffe in the kitchen, and it so happens she's actually wearing the Calder pin in that very photo. The same is true of this photo that we've enlarged of O'Keeffe seated in the 10-foot version of her spiral abstraction sculpture, a sculpture that now stands in the garden of the Research Center at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. We'll talk more about that later, but there she is again wearing that Calder pin, or at least his design. And then I've mentioned already the pastels. So here there's a little group of pastels in this exhibition, both pastels of the commercial kind that O'Keeffe used primarily, and then we have examples of the pastels that O'Keeffe made herself using pigments like the ones in the jar that are also a feature of the exhibition. And I have to just signal this one particular work because it's a small pastel that's just become an absolute favorite of mine since we've included it in this exhibition. Just a really sublime image of what O'Keeffe calls the calla lily turned away. And I love the way that she uses that title because I find it kind of suggestive of a little bit of a personification, kind of giving a personality to this flower. It starts to feel a little bit more like a portrait. And then last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the features of the show, which is O'Keeffe's travels to Japan. So not only the way in which her art was influenced by her exposure to Japanese design, as is the case with the pastel that hangs on the left, but also some of the memorabilia that she returned with. So objects like a bolt of fabric, for example, that she purchased while in Japan, a jacket here of the kind that would be worn over a kimono that she acquired during one of her 2 trips to Japan. And then last but not least, some of the art that results. So one of the 2 paintings of Fuji in our collection. Now, having presented that little overview, what we've promised is really the sort of the deep dive and a little bit of a behind the scenes conversation. So let's get to that now with you, Peta and Justina. I wanted to begin here, as I suggested, with some of the objects that are featured in this particular display. And I actually thought it would be fun for us to start with one of the photographs that, for some reason or other, I seem to discuss the least when I'm giving tours of this exhibition. But it's a fabulous portrait by Tony Vaccaro of Georgia O'Keeffe in that uniform I was referring to, the black and white wrap dresses. We can just glimpse the Hector Aguilar belt. And of course, she is portrayed here with one of her beloved chows. And it makes me think of a previous exhibition at the museum. We featured photographs by Malcolm Varon, who was at Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch photographing O'Keeffe around her 90th birthday. And there's a picture there of that we sort of featured as a reference of the "Beware of Dog" sign that O'Keeffe had up at the Abiquiu home and studio. Peta, can you tell us a little bit about what you recall of your experience living with the chows and how it is that O'Keeffe came to be such a chow lover?
Good morning, everyone. Most definitely. Miss O'Keeffe had chows for the time she was in Abiquiu in the 1950s through her death in 1986. And she once told me that her first 2 chows had come from a very good friend of hers who lived in Sapeo, New Mexico. And he had come to visit her, Richard Pritzloff, in Abiquiu. And she said, he brought me a box of 2 black clouds. Those were her first 2 chows. Now, through the years, Miss O'Keeffe always had a pair. If one unfortunately passed away, she'd get a new one, but she would sort of rotate their names. It was Bo, Chia, Inca, Jingo, and whenever one of them passed away, another one inherited those names. And we do have them in Abiquiu in her garden.
I love this image of the 2 little black clouds, and so it made me think in particular of this photo. And this is one of the rare color photographs that we have of O'Keeffe, and there she is. And in fact, in earlier pictures from the same series, I think we see her brushing the chows. So the chows are getting groomed in this photo, looking more. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Peta.
I'm sorry, Ariel. I just wanted to also note that she always called them her little people.
Yes, the little people. precisely.
Well,
And do you
in
think that
addition to calling them her little people, she was really a fan of the breed. She was actually a member of the Chow Chow Club. And in her personal library, we have a lot of books on chows. And if you visit the Abiquiu home and studio today, you'll find that we still have all the beware of dog signs hanging up around the property.
so were those beware of dog signs, was that also to keep some, maybe some sort of unwanted admirers off the property?
Well, the Chow Chows are very protective dogs, and they were very protective of her. And she was warning people that she had her dogs and her chows, her little people that would take care of her.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Um, I wanted also to return to the case, because we're very fortunate in this in the exhibition to have three really significant loans, and two of those are featured right here. That's a Stetson hat of that sort of flat topped gaucho design that is a loan from the family, in fact, and from the O'Keefe family, and so too the pin that I've shown already that is that's featured in that case. I don't have a really good picture of the hat, but I wonder, Justina, do you've had more more time than most to think about O'Keefe and her and the way that she sort of dressed and presented herself. I think that hat became really a staple of her wardrobe, didn't it?
Absolutely. And, it's called a gaucho hat, but it's also called a vaquero hat. And this was the hat traditionally worn by cowboys in South and Central America, and then eventually was imported to the American West. And as a modernist, I think O'Keefe was really attracted to the simple geometry of the hat, the cylindrical top, how flat it was. And O'Keefe never really decorated her hats, didn't put hat bands on it. And I think too, knowing that it was a cowboy hat, there is this masculine association with that hat, especially during the time period. So choosing to make that I would say, one of the most iconic staples of her wardrobe. She's really adopting a more masculine style of dress, which we also see with other clothes that we have from O'Keeffe's wardrobe. And just in the same way that if a dish chipped, she would still keep it. She liked when her hats looked distressed. So the more worn it looked, the more holes it had, the better for it. And she would continue to wear it well past its prime.
I did notice that in those photographs by Malcolm Varon, there were some in which you could see the light coming through what seems to be a hole, maybe eventually that was worn by the chin strap that she wore with the hat, and so yes, a well-worn hat, and it makes me think also of the white men's shirt she would have tailored sometimes, so that there is this sort of, she adopted whatever suited her best, regardless of whether it was considered to be, a man's accessory or a woman's. Now there aren't all that many accessories in our collection in the sense of jewelry. We don't tend to really associate O'Keeffe with it, but this one piece evidently was very dear to her. Do either of you want to talk a little bit about this Alexander Calder design?
I'll start with that. Of course, it was designed by Alexander Calder for her, and it was first designed in brass. This is the original format, and as you can see, it's very yellowish. And though Miss O'Keeffe was not vain per se, in all those years that I worked for her, she did actually redesign the OK pin, as we call it, when she was in India. Her hair was turning gray by this point, and she once told me that the color of the original pin was not very flattering to her style, and so she had it recreated in silver and wore that as often as she needed to. Miss O'Keeffe's dress was, if she found it comfortable, if she found something that she liked, she wore it for a very long time.
Yeah, so this, in fact, this photograph by Bruce Weber that we had a little glimpse of before, this is her wearing that silver replica of the pin, and so in fact, I think in many of the portraits that we have in our collection, she is probably wearing the silver replica and not, in fact, the Alexander Calder original. And I should have had this image up too, Justina, when you were talking about the Stetson, because you know this I think illustrates perfectly just how worn and broken in, shall we say, that hat of hers was. She's also wearing one of these haori, or a jacket that would be worn over a kimono, and so that's something that we'll be able to return to as well, because one of the themes that we want to touch on today is O'Keeffe's travels, and already we've talked about her time in India, where she had that copy of the Calder pin made, and of course, and then Japan is another one of these places that she traveled to that really very deeply impressed her.
Miss O'Keeffe isn't known very much for having accessories, but in addition to the OK pin, she also had other pins and silver bracelets, and of course the beautiful belt.
Yes, I think of a group of pins that I think I had a chance to show in the library not long after I joined the museum, that were silver pins that she'd acquired in Peru. Very beautiful little figurative ornaments. I did want to return also to this particular chair that we see here on the deck in the display, in kind of in context. And then here I've got an image of it. Now you may have noticed, some of you, that something has been added since that first photograph was taken. We had a lot of interest and a lot of comments about the dedication to Georgia O'Keeffe that is a feature of this chair, for dear Georgia. That's a dedication we can talk about in a moment. In the hand of Ray Eames, one of the chair's two designers. So we thought it would be great to actually add that to the gallery itself. So now it's up there on the wall. But I wonder if either of you want to talk a little bit about, well, perhaps this chair in particular, but then also sort of in more general terms, the way in which O'Keeffe furnished her homes.
I'll talk about how, when she acquired this, Ray and Charles Eames had come to visit her at Abiquiu in 1979. It was either late summer or early fall. In November of that year, Miss O'Keeffe had her birthday, and at the time she would have been 92. And the chair came in the mail. It was a box. And when it got opened, she didn't look at it too kindly. She didn't know what to make of it. She always referred to it as a child's chair, but it was placed in her studio at the time. And after a few days, I recall that a friend came to visit, and first thing she did was lead her to the little chair in the studio. And she would say, "It looks like a child's chair, but it's so comfortable and easy to get out of." And she liked it so much that she asked the Eames if she could have another chair. So we have two in her Abiquiu home. Justina knows a lot about the modern furniture.
Yes, so I think we have a photo of the studio. So if you were to visit the home today, this is how you would find the studio. It's set up as the year 1984, and just so many great examples of modern furniture. So at one point, Georgia O'Keeffe meets the textile designer Alexander Girard. He has a relationship with the Herman Miller Company. So the Herman Miller Company really started in the 1800s, but it wasn't until the 1920s that it received the name Herman Miller Company. And by the middle of the century, they were known for modern furniture. And so Alexander Gerard introduced Georgia O'Keeffe to a lot of these designers, including Ray and Charles Eames. And so when you're at her house, what you're going to see are just these incredible examples of mid-century furniture. What we're looking at here in the photo, that chair that's closest to us with that mesh backing, that's a Bertoia chair. We have this marble tabletop, that is a Saarinen marble tabletop. And it's a little hard to see, but behind the desk, we also have a Saarinen tulip chair. And then, although he was not part of the Herman Miller Company, we do have Barwa loungers. And besides the Eames chair, O'Keeffe said that the Barwa lounger was one of the most comfortable chairs she owned. So she ordered one, loved it so much that she had to order more. And she had this custom padding added over the chair to make it extra comfortable. So what a great place to just sit down, lay back and listen to classical music with your eyes closed.
Thank you. And I should mention that there are one of the sculptures we've already sort of been talking about and seen featured is that spiral design, which is by the fireplace. So that's the 3-foot version of a sculpture, which is also cast, as I said, in aluminum. There's a monumental 10-foot version that stands on the grounds of the O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. And one thing I love about this photograph too is it really allows us to appreciate this the kind of hybrid style of architecture and design that O'Keeffe favored in her houses. So there are so many features of this room that are very traditional, the sort of vernacular style of this part of northern New Mexico with the vigas and the latias in the ceiling. But she's added skylights, for instance, or these plate glass windows, or indeed the mid-century modern furniture that we've just been talking about, so that she really embraces that kind of contrast, not only in the way that she dresses, but also in the way that she lives. Now, moving to another room of the Abiquiu home and studio, we have this little section of the exhibition that's really focused, I suppose, on the pantry. Now, the pantry is actually quite a large room off the kitchen in Abiquiu, and I know that every time that I have either led or joined a tour of the home and studio, I found that visitors are just particularly they're really engaged by the pantry. There's something about it. Do either of you have what is it that you think people are responding to so much when they see those pantry rooms?
When our visitors enter that pantry, I think for a lot of folks, they're suddenly hit with the realization that Georgia O'Keeffe was just like us. A lot of the pots, pans, casserole dishes, spices, baking powder, they're all items that people either still have in their own homes or objects that they grew up with. So I think there's just this familiarity. And it's definitely the most crowded room in the house as far as how much is in there, but it's still meticulously organized.
Yes, I think that's right. I think people seem to oftentimes leave the house with the idea that they are going to go home and maybe organize their homes to look more like O'Keeffe's. I've said sometimes that I think that one thing that struck me in my time at the museum is that I think many of our visitors don't necessarily want to live so much with an O'Keeffe as they would like to live more like O'Keeffe. And I think that the pantry is a really, is as good an example of that as any. Now we have a little detail here of some of the coffee and tea paraphernalia that I mentioned earlier. That's the Chemex coffee maker, is it not?
Yes, that is. So Miss O'Keeffe likes starting her day with coffee, and She discovered the Chemex filter in the 1940s, and she wrote to her friend Maria Chabot, I have a new coffee arrangement. Paper filters you throw away, and it makes the most excellent coffee. Nothing but the glass container, one piece in a paper funnel. So easy to wash, so easy to throw away. And I think with this object, it really embodies not only O'Keeffe's aesthetics, but her values. This is just a beautiful marriage of functionality, simplicity, and beautiful design, because O'Keeffe was practical, and having a coffee maker like this, it was perfect for Miss O'Keeffe.
And now when I started working for Miss O'Keeffe, I started as a companion, and I'm not a coffee drinker. And I had to make coffee for breakfast one morning. First time I had ever made it. My mother was Miss O'Keeffe's housekeeper and cook at the time, and explained to me how I should do it. So I did the coffee that morning after our early morning walk, and I noticed she didn't take a drink. When she came out into the kitchen from the dining room, she tells me, I think if I had put my spoon into this, it would have stood up straight. I made the coffee so strong for her, she didn't dare drink it. But I learned how to make it later on. Bustelo was the coffee she started to use back then.
And I guess we should say a word or two also about her her taste in teas, because we have some of those. Well, the tea tins, they remain in the pantry. A good number of those are still teas that are available today. Some I think are actually Justina, tell me if I'm right about this, that we have some in the gift shop at the Welcome Center that are the very teas that she drank.
Yes, we have the Hu Qua tea, which was a Chinese black tea, and Miss O'Keeffe really liked it. It's incredibly smoky, almost like a campfire. So if you're an adventurous tea drinker, I highly suggest trying it out.
And I think that the tea and the teapots should be mentioned too, because they kind of connect us to a couple of the themes of the exhibition. On the one hand, the fact that those teas came from India, from China, from Japan, and so they speak a little bit to the kind of, you know, the breadth of O'Keeffe's experiences, the in many cases places to which she had traveled, the kinds of dishes that you would find in the cupboards at both Ghost Ranch and at Abiquiu. But also late in life, she would begin, in fact, to experiment herself with the making of ceramics and pottery, and so that too is a feature of the exhibition. We've talked a little bit about how her the assistant who was closest to her at the end of her life, Juan Hamilton, was also himself a ceramic sculptor and potter, and so he introduced O'Keeffe to the practice of making coiled pots. Is that right, Peta? So they're pots of the kind that many of us have actually sort of have perhaps made at one time or another ourselves.
Exactly. At this point in time in Miss O'Keeffe's life, which was her latter life, she decided that she was not comfortable creating works that she was used to, watercolors, charcoals, oils. And so Juan, knowing that she needed to stay creative and wanted to, reintroduced her to clay. She had done the earlier sculptures like the spiral form, a small standing figure in 1916. She used the coil method just as Juan did, and created about 30 works during her latter part of her life. She was very prolific.
Right, and a good number of those are now with the museum. I know that one was included in the work that toured Europe recently, and so I was really glad to be able to include one of those pots as well in this show, alongside some of the tools that were used to sculpt that clay.
Yes, and if you visit the home and studio, we have a few of her pots in the studio and in her bedroom, so you
That's right.
can take a close look at her pottery.
Yeah, very simple forms and very beautifully glazed.
And going back to her tea, she also grew her own. Her second reason for wanting the Abiquiu house was the beautiful garden she could have there. And so she grew chamomile for chamomile tea. She also had different types of mint that were used for tea. And
Yes,
then,
that's right. And many of and some of those dried herbs are and other the produce of the garden are still in their labeled jars, aren't they, in the pantry?
they are.
Well, thank you, Peter, because that makes a very good seg to what I wanted to talk about next, which was O'Keeffe in the kitchen. And the image that we've included in the exhibition is of O'Keeffe standing over a pot at the stove. But I've heard you talk about one of O'Keeffe's favorite contributions to dinner, which was the salads that she liked to make.
Well, she loved salads, things that came out of her garden. She grew lettuces for her salads, but one of her favorites included a watercress salad. The creek in Abiquiu has wonderful wild watercress growing there. And she would have someone go pick some up. She would help clean it out, just as she would help in getting it together. And you could add whatever you wanted to it. Sometimes she loved to add the yellow bell tomatoes, cucumbers. She had a special vinaigrette dressing that she taught everybody who worked for her how to make. Simple vinegar, oil, and herbs out of her garden. Lots of garlic. She loved garlic.
Fantastic. Well, that's what you're saying about the salads makes me think about her interest in natural foods and the way that she really was. I think she was very forward looking in her approach to her diet, and we see this a little bit in the selection of books from her pantry and from her cookbook shelf that we've included in the show. Some are very familiar. They'll be The Joy of Cooking, or the ones we all grew up with, and then others that I think were quite that were very much ahead of their time in terms of this preoccupation with really natural and healthy foods. I wanted also, Justina, to give you a little opportunity, not only for us to talk about some of the objects in the exhibition, but also maybe, if time permits, you can give us a little preview of an exhibition that you're planning, not for Santa Fe, but for the Welcome Center in Abiquiu. So what we've done here, in particular, talking about Japan, is we've included what is only these few objects, a little fraction of the materials that O'Keeffe has that relate to her 2 trips. She was quite imbued with Japanese design and a sort of fascination with the arts of Japan long before she had the opportunity to travel there herself. But there is in the fact that she returns the very next year to Japan for a second trip. So I should mention perhaps that first trip of hers is actually part, kind of remarkably, of a package tour, sort of round the world tour that she took in 1959. And so one of the objects we have in that case on the left is actually the little sort of guidebook for everyone who joined on that trip. We have it open to the page where they're invited to go visit the markets in Kyoto, and but then O'Keeffe returns a second time to Japan, and so there's no doubt that that this was a place to which she felt quite strongly connected. And then I've mentioned already some of the art that results, paintings like this one of two views that we have in the museum's collection of Mount Fuji. So Justina, do you want to give us just a little teaser, a little preview of what it is that you're cooking up?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you come visit us in Abiquiu, starting April 11th, we are opening a new exhibition that is free to the public. It's called Around the World with O'Keeffe. And in this exhibition, we take a deep dive into the many, many international travels that O'Keeffe experienced throughout her lifetime. I believe she went to almost 50 countries. And I will say, even though she traveled to that many countries, she'd always say Abiquiu was still the best. But I do think Japan was a close second. And so when you come to this exhibition, which will be up for an entire year, you'll have an opportunity to see a lot of the souvenirs that she collected, including some of the items we mentioned today, like the silver pins from Peru, some of her textiles, including, a Chinese coat, kimono from Japan, a jacket from Mexico, scarves, and we also have a lot of incredible materials that O'Keeffe collected while she traveled that she used to keep in these shoebox type boxes with labels. So when she would travel, she would keep all of her receipts, brochures, postcards, business cards, scraps of paper with little notes on them, photographs. So if you come here, you'll have an opportunity to see that this summer.
Wonderful. Well, I can't wait. Thank you, Justina. And I do think also, Chikle, that we wanted to leave a little bit of time for people to perhaps pose some questions, because they get to ask questions of all three of us. And I know some of those have undoubtedly been popping up in the chat. So how about I'll just turn it over to you now to pose any questions that people have had.
Definitely. Thank you, Ariel. And thank you, Justina and Pita, for all of this. Yeah, there have been a lot of questions popping up. So I wanted to pick out a few of them and yeah, let's see where that takes us. So I knew that this one would come up, and I think this was the first question that I asked, or at least this was one of the questions that I asked Pita when I first met Pita, which was up in Abiquiu. But the question is, what was her daily schedule like when at home?
Well, of course, I knew her in her later years. This was started in 1974. So she was already 87 years old, though very spry, but she didn't have a set schedule per se. Her meals were probably the only thing that were set up, where breakfast was early morning, her main meal was at noon, and a light supper in the evening. And the day followed whatever happened or she wanted that morning, whether it was dealing with correspondence, visiting with friends, doing artwork, and there wasn't any set time of the day exactly for her to do that. She sort of decided that morning what the day was going to look like.
Awesome. There's another question that says, is it true that the Latias's paint in the studio was washed off by mistake by a housekeeper? I haven't heard that.
Actually, it was. She said, Miss O'Keeffe said that one day she had hired a young girl from Abiquiu, not a housekeeper, but someone that she hired locally to clean the vigas in her studio. And usually when you clean vigas, you just dust them off. And she said, I went to the other part of the house, but she was taking so long to finish. So Miss O'Keeffe said, I came to the studio to see what was going on. and she met the young girl at the door with a bucket of white water. She had literally washed the paint off of the vigas and had this beautiful white stain that has remained on the vigas till today.
Oh, wow.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of the most famous story about the signature on the refrigerator, which I think is like the most shared one. But do you want to share that one really quick?
Definitely. At her house at Ghost Ranch, the pantry is a small size pantry. It's got a very old refrigerator, not very tall. And I stayed with her one summer for quite some time. And I would leave in the morning. I was taking classes and then come back in the afternoon. And so one day I left. One of my aunts, my Aunt Ida, was her housekeeper at Ghost Ranch at that time. And when I came back in the afternoon, I went to let Miss O'Keefe know that I had come back, and if there was anything she needed me to do. And she said, "Oh," she said, "Ida was very upset this morning." And I thought to myself, "Oh goodness, what happened with my Aunt Ida?" And she said, "Oh, Ida was furious. She came in and she told me that somebody had written on the refrigerator, but for me not to worry, she washed it off." It turned out that Andy Warhol had come to visit her at Ghost Ranch and autographed the corner of the refrigerator, and my Aunt Ida washed it off. And Miss O'Keefe was not upset she was more upset that my Aunt Ida was upset than that the signature had been removed.
I mean,
I'm sure
yeah,
Andy would have appreciated it.
yeah, that's so fitting for her personality, I think. So let me see. Let me try to pick out a couple of more questions. Is it true that 3 of O'Keefe's original plants are in her house today? And then they named a couple of different plants, but maybe somebody can speak to that.
Yes, we still have her original plants from 1984, 1986 when she left us. We have several of her jade trees. In fact, we procreate those, and they are available through our gift shop. Her geraniums are still all her own plants. We take care of them, bring them into the house in the winter, and take them out to the sunshine in the summer. She has a giant fern that has been in the dining room for a very long time. And someone I remember gave her an iron plant when I was working for her. It sits in her sitting room. And they told her that no matter what you did to that plant, it would never die. And it's still quite alive, blossoms every year.
Wow.
And this beautiful aloe plant that's in her kitchen, that was also Miss O'Keefe's. It's a beautiful old plant, and it's huge. Very big.
Amazing. So there's another question. I saw a Frida Kahlo, the question says, I saw a Frida Kahlo exhibition and they said they were friends and would write each other. Do you have any of their correspondence together? Or maybe someone could just speak to their relationship too.
Well, yes, O'Keeffe was friends not only with Frida Kahlo, but with Diego Rivera as well, and in fact with Miguel Covarrubias. And so when she went to Mexico City, it was to visit all 3. Now there was an exhibition on Covarrubias that predates me a little bit, but that was organized by the O'Keeffe Museum. It was in the galleries in Santa Fe, and I know there's a wonderful catalog that accompanies that show. So it's an opportunity for anyone to sort of dive a little deeper into those relationships with her friends in Mexico. There are also there were some wonderful caricatures and drawings that were exchanged, in particular between O'Keeffe and Covarrubias. I don't know of any drawings like that or any art of that kind that was shared between her and Frida Kahlo.
Thanks, Ariel. Can someone speak to her, I guess her, so the question is, would she go outside on her property and search for unique rocks? And I know that she collected a lot of different things from around Abiquiu and just around New Mexico in general. So maybe somebody can speak to some of that.
Yes, she definitely collected rocks. I forget the exact number, but we have something close to 1,200 rocks in the collection, each one with its unique accession number, so its own ID number. And she would collect those rocks all over northern New Mexico, so not just on her property. We have a lot of rocks that we believe she got from Chaco Canyon. There's rocks from the White Place. We have beautiful obsidian that we believe is up from the Jemez Mountains. And then, of course, if you were visiting Miss O'Keeffe, you didn't bring her a box of chocolates, you brought her an interesting rock. And so her friends would travel and find rocks different places. And when they would come visit her in Abiquiu, they would bring her a rock. And you would hope that maybe that rock would make it into one of her displays. If she didn't like the rock, she would just toss it in the yard after you left.
Or give it away to someone who especially liked it.
Regifted it.
Yeah.
I remember when I started working at the museum that there was an event being organized at the Home and Studio, and it was a windy day, so we needed to hold down the tablecloth. And one of my colleagues asked me, "Was it all right to put some rocks down to do that?" And I said, "Well, just look under the rocks and make sure there's no accession number." Which is how the museum catalogs the objects in its collection. So as long as there's no number, you're free to use whichever rock you like.
Justina, I have a couple of questions regarding the Ghost Ranch and whether or not it's going to be open to the public anytime soon.
Yes, that's a great question, and one we get a lot. And we don't have any sort of timeline, but in the future, we would love to have the Ghost Ranch property open to the public. And unlike the Abiquiu house, the Ghost Ranch house is not exactly as O'Keeffe left it. And it also is undergoing a lot of conservation work. So just this year, PETA oversaw a project fixing the roof at the Ghost Ranch house. And we have other conservation projects in the work up there. So just stay tuned, and hopefully we have more updates in the future on that.
Thank you. And Ariel, there's a question regarding the pastel of two flowers that is hung in the Japan section. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. I wish I had it up on the screen right now. I would just say that it's one of two pastels that we included in the show, in addition to that lovely calla lily that I showed earlier. And the thing that struck me about both of them when I first saw them was that they had the look of being unfinished works. As it turns out, however, the lotuses, which I showed, which is kind of grouped with the other material relating to Japan, was actually exhibited by O'Keeffe with Alfred Stieglitz. So it is revealed to be something that O'Keeffe considered to be finished enough that she showed it in New York. So that surprised me a little, because it has, there are areas of it that are very unresolved. The reason I included it in this exhibition and placed it where I did is that it has very much the look of being flowers in a flat black dish, and in that way, it made me think of a sort of lacquer box, and what is sometimes the way that flowers are presented in the sort of Japanese ikebana tradition. And so I should say that that's a work that predates by decades her first trip to Japan. So what I'm suggesting is that there's an influence that she felt really from her student days. she was being introduced to not only Japanese art, but to books on Japanese design, and studied under teachers who were themselves very, very very sort of passionate about that Japanese tradition, so that before she's experienced it herself, when she makes those trips that Justina was talking about, there's already sort of evidence of that influence. That's what I was getting at.
And if I might add, the influence continued throughout her life. She had this beautiful ceramic bowl that she had found in Mexico. And during her time, she would put water into that bowl and float hollyhocks. And she cut them really short on the stem, turned them upside down so the flower would face up, and they would just be floating, just as the water lilies that are in the painting look like.
And do you want to mention too, Peta, the way that she trimmed her some of those sage bushes at the
At the Abiquiu house, and even at Ghost Ranch at times, you will see her New Mexico sage being pruned in a bonsai style. She has 2 beautiful junipers outside of her kitchen at the Abiquiu house that are also pruned in the bonsai style. And she enjoyed that very much.
I think that we have time for maybe just one more question. And this reminds me of the first time that I went to go visit her, the home and studio. I noticed the markings that she had on her sound system, which told me that she was really committed and knew exactly what she wanted out of her sound. And I really appreciated that, because I do the same thing with like my sound system. But yeah, the question is around what music she listened to, and maybe what some of her favorite composers were, or any other types of particular pieces of music.
Yes, so O'Keeffe was quite the audiophile. And as you mentioned, she taped down all the knobs and switches on her sound systems so that when housekeepers were cleaning, they wouldn't accidentally dust the audio system and then alter her settings. And so she listened to a wide variety of music, including Latin music and jazz, but I would say she was most enamored with classical music, specifically Baroque classical music. So she loved Bach and Vivaldi, Mozart, and like I said earlier, just laying down in the sitting room with her eyes closed and listening to the music was one of her favorite activities.
Or sitting at Ghost Ranch in her patio and listening to music while she glimpsed out to the Pedernal, which was the view of her front yard.
Awesome. Well, we have a minute left. So I guess I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. Justina, Peta, Ariel, thank you 3 so much. Any questions that were not answered, I'm going to try to jump in and type the answers in if I can get them. And if not, I'm sorry, and hopefully we can make that up to you in the future if we were not able to get to your question. A recording will be made available on the O'Keeffe Museum website. And yeah, thank you all so much, Justina, Peta, Ariel, great to see you all again.
Thank you, Chicler.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.